So what seems to be a exceedingly silly argument has now erupted again. Does Thomas Schoenberger compose? Does he play piano? Little Skills says, why doesn't he credit the orchestra? Well, Little Skills, it's pretty simple. I can hire strings out of Prague, Czechoslovakia. I can go to Slovakia and then go ahead and get cellos. I can get my woodwinds from Scandinavia. You don't need an orchestra these days. You don't need one body of musicians playing simultaneously. You can go ahead and create an orchestra that is global. And so you asked me about proofs. You know, there's no proof, there's only evidence. Proof is restricted for mathematics and alcohol and printing. Okay, so you need to get your facts straight. We've talked a lot about the Bible, and people ask about the proof of Jesus. What we have is evidence. And we know that the epochal parts of the New Testament were written with what they call the Pauline texts, the letters from Paul, and that was later followed by the Gospels and Acts. And there was a chronological order: Mark, Matthew, Luke, Acts, and then John, who was around 90 AD. So that's close to a century after the alleged death of Jesus. And we know that he wrote that in exile, and he talked about future times, and perhaps was an inspiration for Nostradamus and Jules Verne. You never know, right? There are differences within the Gospels, and there had to be an original Gospel, and this is why I study the Quell, the Gospel of Q, because it makes sense to me that there would be an original source, Quell being German for source. So there are differences when you read Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And they differ on the day that Jesus was born. They differ on what people discovered that the tomb was empty, and the tomb was owned by Joseph of Arimathea. We know that. Most believe that Mary went there. Doesn't make a whole bunch of sense because they would have to move a 2,200-pound rock to discover that the tomb was empty. So obviously more than one person went there. And people are always blaming the Pharisees, saying they interrogated Jesus, they condemned him, he died a felon. No, it was the Sanhedrin who did the interrogation. And we don't even know how many people were present at Pontius Pilate's trial of Jesus. So there's a lot of differences going on, which I think explains why we have Calvinists and Catholics and Protestants and so on and so forth, Mormons. Someone said, well, is there evidence that the Gospels and Acts are actual events, chronicled events, and they're not works of fiction? So you've got to go back to your sources. You got to go to Pliny the Elder. And by the way, he died in 79 AD on October 24th. He died by a volcano, Vesuvius. Interesting story. You've got to read your Tacitus, your Josephus. And if you take a look at Pliny the Elder and Tacitus and Josephus, all three of them wrote a century after Jesus was around. After John was written, as in, John of Patmos, John the Exiled, John known as St. John the Divine. So when you read your Tacitus, and I have very carefully, and your Pliny, they don't mention Jesus. They mention the cult of Jesus. Josephus writes twice about Jesus. One about the cult of Jesus, and an original source, which he called the Testimonium Flavianum. However, you've got to look at Josephus. He was working for the Roman government, and he was misquoted many, many times, and the Testimonium was not even mentioned until the 350s, just a couple hundred years after it was supposedly written. So all you have is corroborating evidence of the Gospels outside the Bible. 3 mentions of this small cult of Jesus, and a possible fraudulent testimony. So there's a lot that depends upon faith. And I've had lots of discussions, been to many classes where, the theological faculties of many universities teach this. And so it's very interesting. Take John. John was probably started through an oral tradition around AD 70, and it took a final writing form in the 90s, as I said before. But when you get to the bottom of it, there has to be an original source, a quell, a Q. So, and if you really want to get into ancient history, the person who was the discoverer of the testimony in Josephus was Eusebius of Caesarea. And his nickname was the dishonest cleric because he believed it was okay to lie for the faith. And so if you really want to get into theology, there's a lot to digest. And if you want to do it right, you need to study it with doubt, because doubt is a good thing. Jesus even taught that. You look at Paul with his letters to the Corinthians and his travels to Athens, where he was attracted to an entity called the unknown God. And Paul had a number of Gnostic associations. And, prior to him becoming a Christian, his name wasn't Saul. It was still Saul or Paul. He went by both. What we're left with is Jesus. And he was so inspirational and so ahead of his time. You have to understand that he was coming from a time where the commonality was pagan or polytheistic religious currency. So I look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts, and I think they were written between the 60s and 70s. And so you have a 40-year difference there. I also think that you have to take into account that that the Hebrews were having a war with Rome between 66 AD and 71, 72 AD that ended up with, the famous Masada, where they were wiped off the map. So we can start talking about religion, but I'm probably going to get more into cryptocurrency as we continue. I'm really interested in the altcoins, and I'm really interested in decentralized banking and what's going on right now. I think there's a bifurcation that's healthy for everybody. And I think the destruction of short sellers is a really good thing. I think it's a beautiful thing. So we'll discuss all this if you guys will put up with me. Thanks so much.